Hello. To begin, I want to thank the International Planning History Society for the opportunity to share my research. My name is Michael Brinley, and I'm a PhD candidate in the History Department at the University of Pennsylvania, finishing a dissertation on Soviet territorial planning with the working title Model Cities, Soviet City Planning Institutions and Citizenship in the Era of Developed Socialism, 1957 to 1985. In the mid-1950s, the Soviet Union, facing crippling shortages of capital assets in most sectors, initiated a massive campaign to industrialize construction, part of the global drama of modernism at its zenith. Like many epical changes in Soviet history, the form that this campaign took is traditionally attributed to the will and proclivities of the person at the top, Nikita Khrushchev. But beyond Khrushchev's famous barrages of baffling condemnations and blustering folk charm at photo-op discussions around urban models, the late 1950s and early 60s saw the establishment and institutionalization of a system of design and construction that was implemented on an enormous scale. Well over 200 housing construction factories, Домостроительные комбинаты, or DSK, the headwaters of the prefabricated housing flood, came online in the early 1960s across the Soviet Union, from Murmansk to Ashgabat and from Khabarovsk to Brest. Between 1956 and 1962 alone, over 600 reinforced concrete component factories were built and began production. The size and number of cities in the Soviet Union swelled accordingly. Already major towns and cities sprouted leafy mikrorayon suburbs in a concrete ring around historic cores. Boom towns like Volzhsky, Talyati, and Surgut emerged from the steppe and the tundra seemingly overnight as sprawling arrangements of 5- and 9-story housing units regularly interspersed with H-shaped schools and healthcare facilities. The entire phenomenon was dependent on strict centralization and standardization, but the limitations on formal diversity in residential buildings were matched by a proliferation of experimentation in city planning practice. The number of professional planners grew exponentially in the decades after World War II, leading one Soviet cybernetician to morosely quip in 1968, quote, "At the present rate of development, by 1980, the entire adult population of the USSR will be engaged in planning." Soviet city planners were given a central role in the laboratory of social development during the last decades of rapid urbanization. The responsibility for architectural designs and territorial planning for this vast construction system was assigned to a new state committee on civil engineering and architecture, Gosgражданстрой, formed in 1963. Gosgражданстрой, originally headed by a classically trained architect, became the nerve center of Soviet standardization in architectural design and city planning theory and practice. Over the course of the 60s and early 70s, design institutes across the Soviet Union created general plans for hundreds of cities, old and new. In the process, they provoked widespread public discussion and debate about what a socialist city needed to be and reshaped the dynamic of municipal and regional level Communist Party politics in the Soviet Union. As the guardians of the general plan, chief architects came to play a central role in negotiating between the various interest groups that vied for scarce social and spatial goods. This process was tantamount to a renegotiation of the notion of citizenship, paralleled by the rewriting of the Soviet constitution in the late Soviet period, the years when Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Estonians, Latvians, Moldovans, Georgians, Armenians, and many others became definitively and primarily urban dwellers. My dissertation tells the story of the development of city planning institutions in urban politics in the period from 57 to 85. Drawing on a wide range of published and archival material from 5 major cities and 3 former Union republics, I examine how debates among city planners and between architects and various representatives of emerging social sciences in the 1960s were translated into policy that transformed urban politics and provoked widespread public debate well before perestroika. The urbanization process, on the one hand, a civilizing project normatively imbued with the ideological content of the Communist Party, and on the other hand, an experienced reality about which descriptive indicators were assembled, anecdotal, and aggregated. This process was supervised by technocrats who were increasingly in dialogue with international counterparts over the question of the limits of growth. By exploring these connections, I hope to put the Soviet experience in the context of a broader literature about urban renewal, development, deindustrialization, and neoliberalism in the second half of the 20th century. By grounding my analysis in sources from local archives, I show how changes in planning practice gave Soviet urban dwellers new ways of making claims on their government and new forums for association and mobilization. In particular, the official project to create model communist cities that would cultivate good Soviet citizens gave rise, in part unintentionally, to powerful social movements for environmental conservation and historic preservation. The story of these movements has largely been told teleologically in light of the existential crisis faced by the Communist Party and state in the late 1980s, and spurred on by egregious and high-profile technogenic disasters. My dissertation, by focusing on the practices of building and the politics of urban form, decenters the traditional narrative of event and rupture. Social mobilization around urban problems required an institutional matrix and a particular configuration of the relationships between various scientific communities, industrial interests, international organizations, and urban dwellers. Much of the practice and many of the institutions of city planning that matured during the 1960s and 70s survived the collapse of the Soviet Union and continue to give form to the built environment of most of the Soviet Union's inheritor states. My dissertation argues for an approach that considers institutional and technological change in order to provide the context for social transformation in Soviet cities in the late 20th century. It thus contributes to a growing literature on Second World urbanity, socialist property, and development politics in the socialist world. Thank you.